From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Division, where our star today, Levon Avdoyan, works. And he is the one who created that fantastic exhibit, which you must go and see if you haven't seen it already. But good afternoon. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division, and I'm delighted to host this program today. Welcome to the 16th Annual Vardanants Day Armenian Lecture at the Library of Congress, which this year marks the opening of an exhibition, To Know Wisdom and Instruction, the Armenian Literary Tradition at the Library of Congress. The exhibition and accompanying book were planned to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the first printed Armenian book and press in Venice in 1512, and also to celebrate the designation by UNESCO of Yerevan as the book capital of the world for 2012. We thought that there was no better way to honor these celebrations than by presenting the success of our acquisition efforts, as the collection of Armenian materials at the Library of Congress has grown into a major repository for all levels of research, and due to the efforts of our Armenian and Georgian specialist, Levon Avdoyan. These efforts are closely linked to the name Bardakjian, first of Mr. Arthur Bardakjian and his Committee for the Armenian Collections at the Library of Congress, which was created in 1948. And then Mrs. Marjorie Bardakjian, whose grant from the estate of her husband in 1991 not only allowed us to hire our first Armenian specialist, but also to create such successful programs as the Vardanants Day Lectures. And so our gratitude to her and our thanks to you for joining us in our celebrations today. I want to begin the program by introducing our Associate Librarian for Library Services, Roberta Schaffer. It's an honor and a privilege to have her with us today. She has a staff of more than 12,000 people whose areas of expertise cover the entire globe. Before taking on this enormously important position, she was the Law Librarian of Congress. In a blog posted on the Law Library's website, Roberta Schaffer talked about her life, from which I'm selecting certain highlights. Over the course of almost 35 years, she served in nearly every sector of the library profession: academic, law, nonprofit, professional, legal, and state and federal government. She's a graduate of Vassar. She has an AB from Vassar College. She has an MLS from Emory University, and she holds a JD from Tulane University. She also has a graduate certificate in arts management from American University. She's been admitted to the Texas and District of Columbia and the U.S. Supreme Court bars. She also has a certificate in negotiation from the Harvard Law School and has used her training as a pro bono mediator on a wide range of issues, from local to global concerns. She worked for 9 years as Director of Research Services at the Washington-based international law firm of Covington and Burling. She was Dean of the Library School at the University of Texas in Austin, and before becoming Law Librarian in 2009, she was Executive Director of the Federal Library and Information Center Committee. She has published widely in her field, including editing the Introduction to Transnational Legal Transactions with Merlin Reich. So it is my honor now to introduce the Associate Librarian, Roberta Schaffer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here on the day that this phenomenal exhibit is opening. And I want to say that we didn't plan it to the best of my knowledge, but for the last 2 weeks, major media has focused on Armenia. On Friday, April 13th, so just last week, a review of a movie that was filmed in Armenia appeared in the New York Times. And let me just read a very brief quote from the New York Times article. So they're talking about the filming of the movie in Armenia, and they say, things that are so beautiful, you want to step through the screen and disappear into the Armenia landscape where much of it was filmed. And I think that when you have a chance to view our exhibition, you will also feel that same sense. You just want to be surrounded by these incredible objects that are all from the Library of Congress's overall collection, which is 151 million items. And what I wanted to say about that is that I know that the day that we are celebrating today, while it occurs in February, was first started because of a war that took place, but that it has come to symbolize historically fighting assimilation, cultural assimilation, and particularly in this case for Armenia. And so what the Library of Congress really is, it's not a monument, although one might think that when you walk through our Great Hall, and you might be tempted to believe we are a first-class museum when you go through this exhibition. But we are really a library. But if I were to think of a metaphor for us, I would call us the most incredibly bejeweled crown, where each jewel is gorgeous and perfect, as our individual collections are. But working together, they make something that is spectacular, that is breathtaking, and most importantly, that you could not put a price on. So we are delighted that you are here at the library with us today, and we hope that after you have appreciated us as a monument and as a museum and as a center of learning, you will then someday and some way use us, which is really our base purpose, as a library and as a research to answer the myriad kinds of questions that you have, and know that the Armenian collection is an exemplar of this, but it is not clearly the only thing, nearly the only thing that the library has, but it is clearly one of those jewels in that crown. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I am delighted to see all of you.
Thank you, Roberta. As you know, we are today celebrating the Armenian literary tradition, and today's lecture has been crafted to elucidate that tradition. Our guest speaker is Dr. Kevork Bardakjian, who received his first degrees in Armenian Studies from the University of Yerevan and his DPhil from Oxford University. He taught Armenian literature, language, culture, and history at Harvard University from 1974 to 1987. In 1987, he became the first holder of the newly established Marie Manukyan Chair of Armenian Language and Literature at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and founded and directed the University of Michigan Summer Armenian Institute in Yerevan, Armenia, 2009. From 1995 to 2007, he was director of the Armenian Studies Program at the University of Michigan. Professor Bardakjian has published many books and articles and has lectured extensively in this country and abroad. He is also a fellow of the Armenian National Academy of Sciences and is currently president of the Society for Armenian Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kevork Bardakjian as he speaks on Scribes, Compositors, and the Mind in the Making, the Armenian Script, and the Creation of an Armenian Literary Identity. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Deeb and Dr. Schaffer, for your kind words, welcoming words. And good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests. I'm pleased and privileged to have been given this precious opportunity to share with you certain thoughts and observations occasioned by the 500th anniversary of the first Armenian printed book, and to mark UNESCO's designation of Yerevan, Armenia, as its book capital of the world for 2012. I warmly thank Dr. James Billington, librarian of this magnificent library, my friend and colleague Dr. Levon Avdoyan, Armenian and Georgian area specialist and curator of this marvelous exhibition, and all their colleagues here at the library who, for meticulously organizing this exhibition. I also thank the munificent benefactors, many of them anonymous to me, but some of them are here, Mr. and Mrs. Roger and Julie Kolhanjian Strauk, and many others, as I said, for their support for this gathering, as well as the Bardakjian family and many others whose vision and foresight helped create the superb Armenian collections in the Library of Congress. The Vartanants Day lecture commemorates those who gave their lives in 451 AD to perpetuate Armenian identity. I take this memorable event also to pay tribute to a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Professor Joost Weitenberg, Professor of Armenian and Indo-European Linguistics at the University of Leiden, the Netherlands. Dr. Weitenberg, a gentleman and a gentle soul and a most distinguished scholar, departed from among us just a few days ago on the 14th of April. When Levon asked me to speak on this occasion, what instantly flashed through my mind was some of the poems, a series of poems entitled Ipen Iken. That's, the English is from A to Z, as it were. One encounters in the 14th, 17th centuries. I always wanted to go a little beyond the intriguing title and thought that focusing on the Armenian script as an embodiment of Armenian identity in particular would be a most fitting topic to look at, in addition to the literary tradition, which I will look at in a more general way, as it is simply impossible to go into any detailed discussion to cover a 1,500-year-old tradition. Man very early realized that memory could only be preserved through signs, pictures, or characters, making up words and texts, chiseled, carved, or written on inanimate objects such as rocks, papyrus, parchment, and paper, until, that is, the advent of the age of cyberspace. While the authors of such inscriptions in due course went the way of all flesh, and their physical remains vanished into dust, many of the written records they left survived for thousands of years down to our days. This was only one of numerous ways in which man tried to defeat death, to characterize events as seen by the author, to project an image of contemporary society or a self-image, to promote propaganda, superiority, legitimacy, and continuity, all in a futile effort to achieve that impossible dream, immortality. I have here types of writing systems. I'll stop here at the Cuneiform System. This is the tablet about the founding of Erebuni. The invention of the Armenian script at the turn of the 5th century rendered Armenian into a written language, thereby providing its speakers with the initial contours of a collective memory, an ever-growing repository of accumulated wisdom, a national archive of the Armenian experience, which in turn would give shape to Armenian identity in its various manifestations through the ages. This is, as I said, the core of what I will talk about, with the emphasis on the script. The script was invented by the monk Mashtots, a genius indeed, who to help provide an impetus to the slow progress Christianity had been making since the conversion of King Terdat the Great at the turn of the 4th century. The initial efforts after this fateful invention led to the translation into Armenian of the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, as well as to the emergence of an original literature. On his return from Edessa, with the Armenian script he had invented, Mashtots was met by the king, the Catholicos, and the nobility, the Nakhararars, with much jubilation, anticipation, and inspiration for brighter days for the Armenians in transient as well as eternal life. He then, with his students, embarked on the task of translating the Bible and writings of the Church Fathers into classical Armenian, while evangelizing and establishing a network of schools for knowledge and instruction. For a number of reasons, this was to be a complex and complicated task. Firstly, one must clearly distinguish between a spoken tongue and a written literary standard, which, like all literary idioms, has many artificial components to it. It usually rises on the basis of a widely spoken dialect for universal or overall national aspirations of fateful significance. The express purpose for inventing a script had been to help Christianity strike deep roots in Armenia, and had there been no such vision, classical Armenian likely would not have been forged. Secondly, the Bible was holy writ, the Word of God, and required an absolutely faithful translation. Thirdly, Christian faith and dogma, creed and canon, spirituality and religiosity, moral ethical tenets and praxis were quite different from, if not alien to, pre-Christian or pagan Armenian society at large. All this called for the formation of a literary standard, flexible and precise in expression, capable of articulating abstract thought and concepts, absorbing loan words, coining calques, and adopting especially New Testament Greek syntactical patterns. Consequently, classical Armenian was initially shaped, primarily though not exclusively, into a vehicle of sacred expression. The Armenian script became a venerated instrument as an essential, unique, actually irreplaceable element of Armenian identity. According to his biographer, Koryun, Mashtots himself invented the script through divine grace, but most subsequent historians, beginning with Moses Khorenatsi, attributed this design of the script to the Almighty, who revealed it to Mashtots while he lamented, meditated, and prayed intensely for a script to spread among his people the word of God in the vernacular. This God-given gift, as it became to be known, was seen as the embodiment of the Word of God, and as the intermediary, the instrument that enabled the Armenian hierarchy to establish Christianity in the land. Classical Armenian was a sacred idiom. As in other religious cultural traditions, symbolic and mystical powers have been attributed to the letters of the Armenian script, and hidden metamorphical meanings as well as salvific attributes to the words they form, therefore the language itself. Let me try to explain as simply and as briefly as I can this phenomenon. A number of Armenian authors have elaborated on the concept such as David Anhart of the 6th century, Moses Kertor, 7th century, Grigor Naregatsi, 10th century, Nerses Shnorali, Hovannes Yerzingatsi, and most of all, the last great Armenian theologian of the Middle Ages, Grigor Tatevatsi. Most Armenian authors considered grammar the divine language, logos, that existed before all else and was part and parcel of the universe and subsequent creations. And let's remember the opening words of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So for all else then, before the creation, there was logos, there was language, divine language, and it became part of the creation. Grammar was to be studied for two purposes: to teach to read and write correctly, and to discover the correspondences between the structure of human language and that of the creations in order to reveal the metagrammar of the language. Metagrammar being the language used to describe or analyze another language. Language thus conceived of as a creative and generative act. And in this composite construction, there is seen a microcosm of both humanity and the universe. Regarding the salvific attributes of the language I referred to, Grigor Tatevatsi observed that God spoke directly only to the few who were free from sin: Noah, Abraham, and Moses, and communicate with everyone else through the written word. Thus, writing becomes a manifestation and expression of God's displeasure with human beings. But Tatevatsi then observes that it is through the written word that we attain truth, the divine word. That is through the incarnation of the Word, Jesus Christ, the Word incarnate, that man found salvation. That's the channel. Now, the spiritual language has hidden meanings, and Tatevatsi illustrated how to attain and interpret these meanings through linguistic analysis. There are, he said, 7 doors through which one has to pass to explicate and understand these meanings. There's the drawn letter made up of lines, its name or appellation, the open syllabus formed of a vowel and a consonant, the word itself made up of such letters and syllables, interpretation, interpreting the word, and lastly, the inner meanings, the deepest and highest vision of these words that intellection alone sees and extracts and brings it out. And authors begin to attribute power to the shapes, names, and numerical value of the letters. Hence, one may add, human written language adopts divine characteristics, especially those of God the Logos, which I recited. I need not repeat here. I don't know if I'm keeping up with the elaborating on the concept of embodiment, David Anhart, the 6th century philosopher, said, sound and letter correspond to body and soul. 200 years later, Stepanos Sunetsi maintained that writing was, and I quote, a means of embodying unembodied sounds. It is in this context that I will look into a few Armenian letters and their shape. Now that Christ had left this world, his teaching and mission, captured and encoded in the New Testament, were explicated through exegetical works, hence the significance attached to such genres. But the script itself, as divinely inspired and as the embodiment of the Word of God, and some individual characters were also interpreted as mystical symbols of divine significance. This was not a widespread phenomenon in Armenian letters, but a number of authors, including two giants of Armenian literature, Nerses Shnorali and Grigor Tatevatsi, saw providential representation in the shape of certain Armenian characters. In one of his poems, I'll forego the title, Nerses Shnorali interpreted the three strokes of Ayp the stems, the strokes of, you see these straight lines making up the letter Ayp, the lower case to the right, as a symbol or as the representation of the triune Godhead. Three persons, each stroke representing the Father, the God, Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but one nature. So the letter in its form reflected the Holy Trinity. As he put it, three persons separated, he uses the word separated, but united in one nature, and commented that through this letter, you are enabled to come closest to the Holy Trinity. And for Nerses Shnorali again, the last letter of the original Armenian script, the one you see in the left corner to the left at the bottom, I lost my place. This letter exhorts and comforts us by its likeness to the cross, inspired by its likeness to the cross, of the various suggestions as to the original model of Armenian letter, of the Armenian letter K. One is that it was based on Greek chi, the X as represented in English, and that, and the other, that it was based on Rho, that is the R in Greek, but which looks like the P in English. And there is the unlikely likelihood, I like this phrase, unlikely likelihood, that it was inspired by the Greek chi rho symbol that you see on the rest of the three letters, which stands for Christos, Christ in Greek, and is a sacred symbol. The first one has also at the bottom the alpha and the omega, to which I will refer. Such recognition of the divinely inspired Armenian alphabet as a reflection of Christian Armenian identity also found expression, no, I take that back. I left out a passage. Lastly, the seventh letter of the Armenian script, E, earlier appearing in encyclicals, letters, over church altars, and lately on necklaces and pendants, which is the third person singular of the verb to be, as in I am, you are, he, she, it is. So the E represents the third person singular, and of course is associated with him being the God. This is the Armenian rendition of Greek Septuagint. I think it's chapter 3, verse 14. Ego, eimi, hoon, etc., which the English renders as I am the being. And the Armenian translation of the Greek Septuagint gives vor enen, he who is. This is the letter. It is widely believed that it stands for God or the triune Godhead, a valid interpretation indeed, but my contention is that it stands for Christ, though I won't be able to go into details as the story behind it is long and complicated. Such recognition of the divinely inspired Armenian alphabet as a reflection of Christian Armenian identity also found expression in numerous acrostic patterns employed in poems of religious, moral, and secular content, with the earliest known samples dating from the 7th century. Various arrangements and schemes are found in the so-called abecedarian or alphabetical poems. Thus, entire stanzas or their opening lines alone in sequence may begin with the characters of the Armenian script or may spell the name of the author. Here you see stanzas, each line of which begins with the character of the alphabet. There are 36 to this, but I'm only showing to 2. Or, as said, if you look at the first script, first letter of each line in capital, they spell out the author's name, Nerses. In more modern times, though not as popular, acrostic poems may proclaim a message. A good example of this is the poem by Yerevan State, who was one of the principal reasons for his murder by the regime in the Soviet Union. He hid the acrostics message made up of the second letter of each line, not the first line. So it was very well hidden, and it said, "O Armenian people, your salvation is in your collective power." I have highlighted those in English. He didn't go public on this, but someone found out and he was denounced to the authorities. In early modern times, we also encounter some poems entitled Ipen Iken, I refer to, that is from A to Z, and some with the alphabet in reverse order, Kn I hyphen, from Z to A. This title, if not the content, and its symbolism comes, it seems to me, from the revelations, I am the Alpha and the Omega, as I mentioned maybe. I have looked into these poems, but I have come to the conclusion that they are simply an echo of this and do not reflect the spiritual divine aspects of that phrase, I am the Alpha and the Omega. To return to the 5th century, following the invention of the Armenian script, the art of translation flourished into a magnificent tradition. Translations illuminated, broadened, and enriched the scope, outlook, and aesthetic artistic qualities of Armenian letters. Patristic, dogmatic, Christological, homiletic works, commentaries, and religious, philosophical, rhetorical, linguistic writings opened before the Armenians the luminous gates of the Christian world and its traditions, and helped to a very considerable degree forge the Armenian dogma and theology as the religious, moral, and social foundation on which the Armenian Church rose as an autocephalous national institution with its very own language, script, magnificently illuminated manuscripts, and art and architecture. Samples of manuscripts, but you've seen some here. Music and religious poetry. One has to be mindful that it was this national institution, the church, that forged the new Christian Armenian ethos, or identity, if you will, on the ruins and relics of pre-Christian or pagan Armenia, through religious works, translations, and to a much larger degree, through original compositions, with historiography playing a leading role. One must also bear in mind that such accomplishments were attained thanks to the Armenian script, as an embodiment of wisdom, a channel of transmission, a crucible of imaginative thought and new concepts, and a medium of instruction and training. As one reviews the emergence of the Christian Armenian self-image in retrospect, one may be tempted to attribute to a deliberate, contemplated plan on the part of early Armenian historians and luminaries. We may begin with Agatangelos, who recorded the miraculous history of the conversion of Armenia establishing a legitimate origin for the new faith. The philosopher Yeznik elaborated the superiority of Christianity over Greek philosophy, Zoroastrianism, and heresies. Yerevan, in the account of the Battle of Avarair, of that of Vartanants, formulated the initial contours of the new Christian Armenian identity, promoting loyalty to the ancestral faith and land, language, and culture as the pillars of the Armenian corporate self. He was followed by Moses Khorenatsi, perhaps the greatest image maker of them all, who in his history of Armenia provided the Armenians with a biblical pedigree, proclaiming Haig, the eponymous forefather of the Armenians, and his posterity as the direct descendants of Japhet, son of Noah, and placed Armenia in the context of world history. Around the time Hovhan Oznetsi codified the Armenian canon law in early 8th century, the Christian Armenian tradition had been firmly entrenched. Thus, when the Arabs conquered Armenia in the second half of the 7th century, the corporate Armenian self-image rested securely on the pillars of the Christian tradition, immune to assaults, cultural and otherwise. The second millennium brought with it fears and anxieties over the impending release of Satan and marked in Armenian realities major shifts, demographic, political, and otherwise, and as increasingly large numbers of Armenians left or were made to leave Armenia proper. Moving in a westerly direction, they settled in Cappadocia and Cilicia along the northeastern shores of the Mediterranean, where they soon set up a diaspora state par excellence, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. This is the historical juncture when what we now call Middle or Cilician Armenian imposes itself as the literary standard. I reiterate here my contention that classical Armenian emerged primarily for the specific purpose of fostering Christianity. Indeed, although the whole classical Armenian corpus encompassed a very wide range of topics, it was nonetheless somewhat limited in scope in that it lacked the secular, temporal, earthly, social, and quotidian aspects of Armenian society. For similarly overriding and all-encompassing national need, Middle Armenian emerged as the quote-unquote state language and as the literary standard at the time, that is the 12th century. It was the language that the Armenians emigrating west and southwest carried with them, the vernacular that they carried with them, that is the vernacular that they spoke, which must have been slightly different from forms of the vernaculars spoken in Armenia proper before the 10th century. Because there are people who think mistakenly that this was a new language. It was not. I believe that this was the spoken language in Armenia proper, which its speakers carried west, and it was elevated to the dignity of the new literary standard. And it is these masses who came from the east that made up the Armenian population of cosmopolitan Cilicia, the new center of Armenian statehood. Obviously, for its structures and mechanisms, legal system and government to function, and in order to legislate and enforce the laws, Cilicia had to resort to an idiom comprehensible to the population. The language it employed then was to serve primarily a political entity, less so for the church and religion, and an entire civic society, not just the clerical circles. An almost equally significant factor was the social, political, economic, and cultural changes in society, dispersion, intermingling, and contacts with neighboring traditions, and the Crusaders, as well as the increasingly growing number of authors who wrote mainly on secular themes. at least two discernible layers between, say, medical treatises, written or translated into the current popular speech for the common folk, and lyric poetry of the time highlight the differences between the two styles. Literary Middle Armenian must have been improved and polished at the hands of poets and historians of the period. A very large, charmingly vivid body of literature is attested from this period, created throughout the Armenian dispersion in Cilicia and far beyond, covering a very wide range of topics and concerns. Although all topics abound, most authors bring their eyes down from celestial spheres to observe and write of fellow human beings and compatriots, their plight and needs in fields such as medicine, legal texts, secular law codices, native and in translation, fables, celestial bodies and the firmament, calendrical works, historiography, chronicles, chronologies, and colophons. Knowledge and education are promoted in often short-lived monastic schools, referred to sometimes as universities. Translations are made from Arabic, Latin, and Old French, with two new letters added to the original script, the round O and the sound F, which Armenian originally did not have. A good deal of polemical literature was produced to combat the Latinizing missions. Middle Armenian, though a bond of unity in almost all the texts attested from the period, found its best expression in lyric poetry, which underwent some Islamic, particularly Persian, influence. New genres and themes such as love, women, the here and the hereafter, the clash of body and soul, and exile reflected the preeminence of secular motifs at the same time as authors such as Nerses Shnorali and Vartan Araveltsi fostered and embellished the received tradition of Armenian identity. Certainly, Armenian literature was abundantly enriched by an ever-growing number of writers, with perhaps a slightly larger number of students and audience than before, for we know of an entire village collectively paying or sponsoring the copying of a manuscript. But this is an inadequately explored realm that awaits meticulous and painstaking studies in order to gauge the impact literature had on society. Establishing the provenance and peregrinations of Armenian manuscripts and their circulation would be one, albeit partial, way of casting some light on such effects. There are, nonetheless, a few books and articles elaborating the circumstances under which texts were written or copied. The scribes were mostly monks who toiled in scriptoria in monasteries in abject circumstances of poverty and insecurity. Indeed, many are the scribes who fled from one place of hiding to another, completing the copying of manuscripts in various inhospitable places, with negative consequences for the quality and quantity of manuscript production. Yet Armenian scribes, with tenacious belief and dedication, channeled the tradition to posterity. An inspiring case is that of Hovannes Mangasarens, also known as Ardishetsi, a 15th century scribe who, in 72 years, copied nearly 132 manuscripts. In a little over 100 years after his death, printing presses would outshine and infinitely outnumber the extraordinary effort of Mangasarens and his confreres in disseminating knowledge and wisdom. Nearly 60 years after Gutenberg's invention, the first Armenian book was printed in Venice, as you already know, in 1512. Printing had an enormous and immediate impact on European letters and rapidly developed into an industry, opening up and channeling the world of human thought, wisdom, and knowledge to the public at large. Armenian printing initially developed mainly in Europe with little impact on Armenian letters. It gathered momentum towards the end of the 17th century and flourished thereafter in Constantinople and Armenia proper, in addition to its place of origin. Although the Church of Armenia soon pursued the dream of printing religious books in general, and that of the Bible in particular, the opposition of the See of Rome delayed the publication of the Armenian Bible to 1666. It took about 30 months to publish the first Bible, as Rome insisted on imposing the Vulgate as the authentic scriptural version. This was a serious concern for the Armenian Church, owing to the differences between the Latin and Armenian biblical traditions that encroach on the religious national identity of the Armenian Church. Many important books were published before the Bible, thanks to individuals and small groups of devoted figures and the support of Armenian merchants. Many of these books were of general interest, destined to illuminate the public or interested circles according to the lights of the publishers and their supporters. Such circles were the Armenian merchants who were interested in psalters, small size. The works of earlier authors such as Nerses Shnorali and Grigor Dadevatsi, the celebrated Letter of Pact, a pact supposedly signed between Armenia and Rome in the 4th century, whereby the Romans undertook to protect Armenia when invaded by outsiders, psalters and breviaries, hymnals and calendars of feasts, songbooks, arithmetic, weights and measures, astrology and medicine, etc., etc. Of particular interest are two books on arithmetic, one published in Marseille in 1675, considered by many the first book published in what many recognize as modern Armenian. This is of particular interest because there are varying theories, arguments about the rise of what we call modern Armenian. The Psalter published by Nahabet Aguletsi in Venice in 1687, where the Psalms in classical Armenian are juxtaposed with a translation into modern Armenian, which indicates that the publishers were interested in disseminating a message, proving helpful to the reading public, no matter how restricted their numbers, and especially the Armenian merchants. It was, however, Mkhitar and his congregation that first embarked on systematic publishing activities, at first by Italian publishers, and later through their own printing press in San Lazzaro, which you see down there, a tiny islet in the lagoon. Mkhitar's activities centered mainly on religious books, both original and in translation. He pursued his own agenda to bring about a religious awakening among the Armenians. That was the original mission that he embarked on, and turned down requests for publications by other authors. Following the publication in Livorno in 1698 of Eremia Meghretsi's Armenian Dictionary, the Mkhitarists published in 2 volumes Mkhitar's crowning work, Bargirk Haykazyan Lezvi, Dictionary of the Armenian Language, followed by the monumental Nor Bargirk Haykazyan Lezvi, exhibited here, New Dictionary of the Armenian Language in Venice, which took about half a century to compile and was published in 2 volumes in 1836 and 37. Earlier in 1784, the Mkhitarists had published Mikhail Chamchian's History of Armenia in 3 volumes, perhaps the second major attempt at writing a comprehensive history of the Armenians. Translated into Ottoman Turkish and English, its impact was enormous on generations of Armenians and in passing down the old received tradition. The Mkhitarist publications of early Armenian historians, their research into the Armenian language, history, and literature, brought to life and light the received Armenian tradition with unfathomable impact on Armenian identity, especially in the 19th century, as a catalyst to major reviews and reinterpretations of the Armenian past, particularly in the 19th century. Of course, Many other centers of printing elsewhere played a vital role in shaping the Armenian worldview, in particular Constantinople, where to 1915, the overwhelming majority of Armenian books were printed. Special mention should be made to the Armenians of India, who, in sharp contrast to the Mkhitrists, placed an almost exclusive emphasis on books of political nature, thus making the first major effort to introduce the hitherto lacking political element into the Armenian self-image. The significance of the Armenian script as a vital element of Armenian identity is evident in the Armeno-Turkish literature, that is, texts composed in Turkish but written in Armenian characters. This was foreseen for Armenians who did not speak their mother tongue, and its origins can be traced back to the 14th, 15th centuries. In the earlier period, up to the end of the 17th century, it seems, such literature was written in Armeno-Kipchak, Kipchak being a Turkic dialect, but the overwhelming majority of such works were in Ottoman Turkish. This is Armeno-Kipchak. This Armeno-Turkish, Don Quixote. But the overwhelming majority of such works were in Ottoman Turkish, published from the 1720s. Ironically, among the earliest Armeno-Turkish texts is a grammar of modern Armenian composed by Mkhitar in Turkish in 1727. In publishing Armeno-Turkish books, religious propaganda and polemics were uppermost in the minds of the Vienna Mkhitrists and the American missions and missionaries. Later in the 19th century, some Armenians wrote in Turkish and translated in Turkish the works of leading European authors. As Armenian prevailed, the number of Armeno-Turkish publications dwindled to a negligible number towards the end of the 19th century. I do remember, though, as a child in the 1950s, listening to sermons preached in Turkish in one of the Armenian churches in Aleppo. Moving on to the 20th century, an ominous threat to the Armenian script as a component of Armenian identity arose in Soviet Armenia, where an orthographic reform was proclaimed in 1923. Boris Magintsian, a former Commissar of Education, was of the view that the Armenian alphabet should be replaced with the Latin script. The adoption of the Latin script, Magintsian foresaw, for all the peoples of the Soviet Union, including the Russians. It would, he averred, unify all peoples of the Union, including those who did not have their own alphabet. This was the poor reasoning of an ideologically motivated intellectual, which fortunately was soundly and resolutely rejected by all. But a partial reform in spelling was formally adopted. It is still in use in Eastern Armenian. The question of reform was not new, nor has it been confined to Armenian alone. Those of us who have consulted old Armenian manuscripts are aware of the inconsistencies and discrepancies in spelling found abundantly in medieval texts. The issue of uniform spelling in various forms and suggestions arose in the 19th century. The most radical scheme was that published in 1853 by Nahabet Rusinyan, a Western Armenian intellectual and a member of the Educational Council under the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople. It was rejected and banned by the Patriarchate. The scheme appeared at a time when the Western Armenians were engaged in heated debates as to whether classical or modern Armenian should be recognized as the literary standard. In this case, too, identity was of decisive significance, especially for the classical camp, which held that classical Armenian was the ancestral tongue and the language in which God spoke, and which would unify the Armenians linguistically, since modern Armenian was spoken in many dialects in many places. But life dictated its own, and just as in the case of classical and Middle Armenian, aspirations for administrative reform and the so-called constitutional movement propelled modern Armenian to the dignity of the national standard for the Western Armenians, and Eastern Armenian for the Eastern Armenians. Most Western Armenians, the Mukhitrists and Western scholars of Armenian, rejected the Soviet Armenian orthographic reform. They felt that it cut them off from the old Armenian tradition and that it distorted their linguistic, literary, and therefore national identity, and disrupted the linguistic unity of the two halves of the Armenian people. Objections and calls for restoring the old spelling were renewed after the independence of Armenia, but so far to no avail. Although many intellectuals and scholars in Armenia have voiced their strong support for restoring the old, the Armenian public in Armenia has come to identify with the reformed system. The old Armenian spelling may one day be restored, but it may come a little too late. The Armenian diaspora, already a permanent phenomenon, is in retreat. The number of Armenian speakers is dwindling rapidly. Fewer works of literature are being produced, with alarmingly fewer readers. New generations of Armenians are writing in English in the US, in French in France, and in other languages elsewhere. I know I will not live long enough to see the day, but I have long been wondering what Armenian identity in the diaspora, literary and otherwise, would look like in 100 years hence. At the same time, I have lived with and remembered the powerful, indelible image my parents and grandparents have impressed on me, that of a dying Armenian woman during the genocide, writing the Armenian alphabet in the sands of the Syrian desert and teaching it to her son. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bardakjian. I feel I'm back and learning. I've learned so much from your presentation. That was quite an expose. Thank you. And now we have the star of our Armenian Today program, exhibit, and book, Levon Avdoyan, the Armenian and Georgian area specialist here in the division since 1992. He received his MA and MPhil and Ph.D. in ancient history with a minor in Armenian history and civilization from Columbia University. He joined the Library of Congress in 1978, where he became a specialist in classics, ancient history, Byzantine studies, and the Middle Ages in 1982. In 1992, he became the library's first area specialist for Armenia and Georgia. He has published widely on Armenian history and on library matters related to it. He is also the curator of the exhibition, which officially opens today, and the author of its catalog, To Know Wisdom and Instruction, a visual survey of the Armenian literary tradition from the Library of Congress. He is also the author of other books, and you can find them on the library's catalog. Today, Dr. Avdoyan will speak on the continuity and change of an Armenian identity in the digital age. Levon Avdoyan. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Please, thank you. It's almost as though I've achieved my dream and performed a sonata on the, at some public stage. And I don't know how I'm going to speak after that, but thank you so much. And by way of thanks, this is my opportunity to steal a few extra minutes, if you don't mind, and to tell you that things like an exhibition and a book do not occur in a vacuum, and especially not here. I have many people to thank. And first off, I would like to share with something about Kevork that proves he's a man of both exquisite scholarship, but integrity. Because shortly after he accepted the speaking engagement, he was elected to the Armenian Academy of Sciences. And learned that for the installation, he would have to be in Armenia tomorrow. And he chose to honor his commitment, even though we said it would be fine with us if he would choose to go to Armenia. But that is what I call integrity, and we are eternally grateful. Now, as to a vacuum, the idea of this exhibit took place 2 years ago, and as usual, I went running to the division chief, Mary Jane Deeb, and to the section head of the Near East section, Chris Murphy. We usually bat my ideas around a while, but this took immediate ground. So without them, it could not have happened. It then went on to discussions above them, and it was accepted. It then went to the development office where Sue Siegel and Mark Connor directed me in the still bewildering function of fundraising. I then started the ruminations on the catalog after selecting objects from the collection, and I don't know if they're here or not. Yes, I see one person. Ralph Eubanks of the publishing office took on the task, and my brilliant, wonderful, and very, very calm editor, Amy Hess, who is with us today, guided us through the catalog, which you will see. The Interpretive Programs Office. Simply described, they mount the exhibits. Well, if you walk into today's exhibit, you'll see that it is so much more than that. I can't name them all, but obviously I will name William Jacobs, its director, and my exhibition director, Martha Hopkins, and 4 very dynamic people. Karen Worth, and I have no idea how you got through all those contracts. Chris O'Connor, Tambra Johnson, and Mark Roman. I mean, if you saw what was there 7 days ago and what is there now, you would see that this is their achievement. As to conservation, you look at these items, they didn't come in this shape. We take exquisite care, and for this particular show, we have to thank Kara Shafi, Claire Deckel, Yasmin Khan, and Tamara Ohanyan, and the delightful people at special events, Jared McNeil, for doing this. And of course, I have to thank all of our donors, Mrs. Marjorie Dadian, who remains a favorite with all of us, who died way too young. Personal friends, Rita Balian and Ani Tota, Roger and Julie Kulhanjan-Strauch, and the Dolores Zorab Lieberman Fund for their major. So I thank them all. But I would like to start my brief comments by also dedicating this to a lost colleague, Jos Weitenberg, who is a gentleman who fought kidney disease for such a long time and succumbed this week. So Jos, this is for you. Now, after that lecture, and I know you want lunch, but I'm going to go ahead. My intent today is to offer only a brief coda to Professor Bardakjian's enlightening presentation, which concerned 2 important events in the historical and cultural life of the Armenian people: the creation of a unique alphabet perfectly suited to express the previously unwritten Armenian language, and the first printed book, which happened some 1,100 years later. Here we are 500 years after Hagop Mechapart's Book of Fridays, and we have dashed headlong into what I consider the 3rd phase of the Armenian literary tradition, the digital era. Will its impact be as profound as the prior 2? I would argue, however, that these events transcend mere literary identity and have everything to do with the core identity of the Armenian people. And so, what is that exactly is identity, or rather, what markers are used for a person to express his identity? I have often likened identity to an onion. It is evident that the self is at the core, whether the individual admits it or not, and they often do not. The external layers are the least important to a person's identity, but as you get closer to the core, the more important race, ethnicity, family appear. Many have maintained that one's primary identity is religion, but if that is the case, conversion would be a rare phenomenon. In general, it's difficult, if not nearly impossible, to give up one's primary identity. Now, although most religious Armenians belong to the autocephalic Armenian Church, there are Armenian Catholics, such as the founder, Mahatar Sebastatsi, of the monastery of San Lazzaro in Venice. There are Armenian Protestants. There are Armenian Jews, and whether they want to admit it or not, there are Armenian Muslims. So I reject, then, the statement made by one audience member who attended a lecture I gave, a series of lectures I gave at a local church here, St. Mary's. She maintained that there were no Armenians before the adoption of Christianity. I think the king Tigranes the Great in the 1st century BC, who extended the land to its greatest extent, would probably argue about that. Now, language certainly comes as close to the center as one can get after family and ethnicity, whatever that is, ethnicity that is. Dr. Bardakjian has described the creation of the Armenian alphabet a mystical event that began the literate age for the Armenians. Ostensibly, the motivation for this was the need to have materials in a language the people could understand to strengthen and further propagate the Christian faith. However, it is important to note that this event also happened at the time that 4/5 of Armenia was under Persian suzerainty, and that the Persians themselves were using a relatively new Pahlavi script, a native script, for their language, and not Aramaic, which had been for centuries the lingua franca of that area. The creation of the Armenian alphabet was, in the end, responsible for the retention of the Armenian language itself. It is certainly not unique to the Armenian people among all those in a diaspora. Can you be a member of an ethnic group without speaking the language? Is cooking pilav and preparing shish kebab in the Armenian style enough to make you Armenian? Now, I can't answer that question. Everyone seems to have their own criteria by which they measure that answer. I can only offer my own formula, which is that I believe anyone who tells me that he or she is Armenian, because frankly, I can't think of a reason you'd claim to be if you weren't. So maybe I'm easy. Now, I confess, though, that language and literature go far to identify a group, and have for millennia. Consequently, the creation of the Armenian alphabet in circa 406 AD and the publication of the first book in Armenian are certainly responsible for the retention of Armenian culture, both in times of statehood and statelessness. It is often maintained that at such times the church has preserved and transmitted the culture. True. But without the language, this would not have been possible. It may seem that I have been skirting the issue at hand, namely Armenian identity in a digital age. I assure you I have not. The digital age began in earnest roughly at the same time the Soviet Union fell and an independent Republic of Armenia was proclaimed in 1991. The internet allowed those of us in the diaspora to experience what was going on in the homeland. It also allowed a growing number of practiced technologues within the Republic to help us keep abreast with those historic events. But what concerns me in the remaining minutes is how the questions of identity, or rather the differing concepts of who is or who is not Armenian, have colored the beginnings of this period. There are users of Eastern Armenian, spoken and written in the Republic and Iran, and Western Armenian, spoken and written in most of the diaspora. Fundamental questions such as who has the right to create the coding for the Armenian alphabet occupied more than a decade until the general adherence for most, and I stress, the general adherence for most to Unicode, that universal standard of vernacular script, came about. We are not as fortunate as to have a universal standard for transliteration of the Armenian alphabet, and consequently some letters, such as the R with a dot under it, remain elusive for universal comprehension. In short, although a new period of lively cooperation does exist between the Republic of Armenia and various diasporan homes, many basic questions are far from resolved. In the early days, I feared that there would be no room for the Armenian language at the digital banquet. At the very least, I have changed my mind about that. There are those of us among the librarians and scholars who rejoice in the countless newspapers, government reports, blogs, literary catalogs, digitized graphic images such as full manuscripts, photographs, illuminations, born digital materials, namely those things that are exclusively provided electronically, and all sorts of works, both among the Armenians and in the languages of the diaspora, now are readily available. Indeed, although much Armenian is now buzzing around in the ether, we are more and more in the era of a lingua anglica. It's no longer a lingua franca. We're in an era of a lingua anglica, arguably the language of the net. And as Dr. Bardakjian pointed out, many Armenians are choosing to use that for universal comprehension. Now, retention of the well-known Armenian literary identity requires cooperation on all levels, uniform standards, both in vernacular and transliteration, a developed optical character recognition that would allow accurate scanning of Armenian text, resolution of copyright issues that would lead to the mounting of Armenian manuscripts from all ages available to all researchers freely, such as, I will reiterate, every public domain material in the exhibit that you will see today will be fully digitized and mounted at the end of this year, available on our website and through the World Digital Library for free to all. There's a recognition, there must be a recognition that all three Armenians, Grapar, the classical, Eastern and Western, are indeed makur, are indeed pure, and they are important markers of identity, and all must be preserved and retained. These and other measures will assure the retention and survival of a literary identity and tradition. But as to change, every country is open to the world now. There are few secrets. Everything is in flux. Ideas are exchanged with immediate speed. Literary trends are shared. Technology is developed to match. I am no prognosticator, and I certainly will not be around when this happens. But just as the publication of the first Armenian book for the use of a wealthy mercantile class led inexorably to a period of enlightenment and a renewal of Armenian literature and scholarship, which Kevork traced brilliantly, so too will this new era produce both continuity and change. If we allow it, and if we are wise enough to archive it for the use of those who in the future will consider themselves Armenian. Thank you. Now, thank you very much. I appreciate, oh. Thank you so much. So this is what it feels like. Thank you. You are very kind. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.